Hello and welcome to Third Histories. This is going to be the fourth episode in a multi-part series we're doing here on the Comanches. The first three episodes might help give you, some background and context to what we're going to be talking about today. But of all the episodes we're going to put together here, this might be one that can be consumed individually. We're going to get into the Comanche conflict with the early Anglo settlers in Texas, at a point in history where Texas really begins to break away from the Spanish Empire, first unofficially and then officially, as it becomes the Republic of Texas. Now, a bit of forewarning before getting into this show. If you have listened to the first, either three episodes or one of the first three episodes, well, maybe you've noticed that I have not played up the violence that, is available in the historical record. And if you weren't aware that such violence was available to me, well, now you know. But today we're going to have to depart from that earlier approach. Today's episode is going to involve numerous descriptions of violent, even nearly sociopathic violent behavior that, makes this show probably not ideal for children or for the squeamish. So you've been forewarned. And despite what I've just discussed, I hope you enjoy this show on the Comanches and the Texans. Putting aside those who came to the New World unwillingly and in shackles and chains, I've always thought that to be an American is to be a special kind of crazy. And to be a frontiersman is to really be the most special kind of crazy out there. For starters, you had to leave everything you knew behind in Europe or Asia for some. You had to risk a ship ride across the Atlantic Ocean. Sometimes this was during a time where it wasn't always clear that that ship would arrive at the New World at all. And instead it might end up at the bottom of the ocean. So you had to risk a ship ride, and then this was in order to join a sort of interesting and new population. There's a mix of religions, ethnicities, values even, if you're coming to the New World in the 19th century, for instance. And then let's say you get here, and then you decide you'd like to keep plunging into unknown frontiers. You want to go out west in North America, specifically in the United States. Well, I just think that takes a special kind of person. And it takes someone who is fearless, at the very least. And for reasons we'll discuss today, finding yourself in Texas in the early 19th century, well, you are a brave soul. Teddy Roosevelt once wrote the following, quote, "The conquest of Texas should be properly classified with conquests like those of the Norse sea rovers. The virtues and faults alike of the Texans were those of a barbaric age. They were ruthless, brave, and eager for adventure, excitement, and plunder. They were warlike, resolute, and enterprising. They had all the marks of a young and hardy race, flushed with pride of strength and self-confidence. On the other hand, they showed again and again the barbaric vices of boastfulness, ignorance, and cruelty. And they were utterly careless about the rights of others, looking upon the possessions of the weaker races as simply their natural prey." End quote. I really don't think the pure insanity of some of these men can be properly understood, but let's, give it a try. One example might be a man named Philip Nolan. Even the words to describe Nolan in the sources call back to a different world, right? He was a Mustanger, a freebooter, and a filibuster. What Nolan really was an Irishman living in French Louisiana who raided into Spanish Texas for wild mustangs that originated in Moorish Spain. So there's a number of different ways you can describe Philip Nolan. I like that one the best. Now, he'd made a pretty accurate map of Texas. This is in, I believe, the late 1790s, and then, in about 1800, I think on the dot, actually, is when he's doing this. And he gained permission from the French Louisiana governor, he got permission from him to head into Texas to obtain horses and then sell them back to the French military. All right, so if we know what's going on in Texas, we know what Philip Nolan is willing to face, for those who've listened to the last three shows. Now, Nolan was a longtime employee of one of early America's most notorious figures, General James Wilkerson. And he actually worked as his bookkeeper and in various other capacities since he was a teenager. Now, we do know a few things about Wilkerson that we can sort of point out here. One, he was a highly paid spy working for the Spanish government. Two, he, along with Aaron Burr, America's third vice president and the man who killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel, Burr and Wilkerson very well might have plotted to take over portions of Texas on their own and carve out a totally new country. And it's possible that Nolan was the spearhead of this plot, the man on the ground actually sort of gaining the information necessary to bring this all forward. Now, Nolan re-entered Texas without Spanish permission in October of 1800. He brought about 20 armed men and some slaves with him, and the Spanish at that point had standing orders to kill on sight Nolan and any men he brought there, which is what they did in a shootout somewhere near the Brazos River. Or at least they killed Nolan. Many of his men were taken as prisoners and awaited 7 years for an official sentence from the Spanish government. And after 7 years of waiting for a sentence, they find out that 1 in 5 is to be hanged, and the rest sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. From my sources, it seems like the 1 in 5 number is just sort of plucked out, and that's exactly how it seems like they decided who they would hang. Before the hangings were carried out, 11 of the 20 prisoners had already died in prison, so there's only really a few left to hang if you want to. So the Spanish official charged with carrying out the sentence decided to only hang one of the Americans. This man was selected literally by throwing dice. And after hanging the man who rolled the lowest number on the dice, it seems like all but one of the Americans died serving out the rest of their sentences. Now, this survivor was named Peter Ellis Bean, another sort of young, ambitious adventurer that will end up making the early population here so colorful. Now, he was only 17 at the time he was arrested by the Spanish, and thus he had spent the first decade of his adult life in a Mexican prison. Well, not quite a Mexican prison just yet. The Spanish at this point still have control of New Spain. That's where Peter Ellis Bean had spent basically his entire adult life. And the way he gets out of prison is by volunteering to fight for the royalist side in the Mexican Revolution that was going on at the time. And for some reason, the Spanish let him go fight. And he immediately defected to the revolutionaries, and then convinced those revolutionaries to let him go meet up with some important Americans back in the United States to try and convince them to send aid to the anti-royalist, revolutionaries in Mexico, or what is soon to be Mexico. Now, he first arrives in New Orleans just as Andrew Jackson's army is fighting against the British in the Battle of New Orleans, a battle that would make Andrew Jackson quite famous. Peter Ellis Bean serves in that battle, and now you'd think that, well, at this point, what would possibly compel him to return to New Spain? But that's exactly what he decided to do. And not only that, he was made a colonel in the new government's army, the new Mexican government's army, and he'd spend the rest of his life going back and forth between Mexico and the United States, and he had a wife in both countries. Not Mexico and the United States. He'd go back and forth between the new country of Mexico and then later on the new country of the Republic of Texas. And the wife thing doesn't change. He has a wife in each of those. And he served in the military everywhere he went and ultimately died in Mexico alongside his Mexican wife in his early 60s. Now, another example of an early settler who is a quite interesting person is Moses Austin. Moses Austin is descended from early Puritan settlers. He is a teenager all throughout the American Revolutionary War. He gets involved in the mining industry, but soon sort of becomes a debtor and then flees to Missouri, which at the time is held by Spain still. And there in 1803, he becomes the principal stockholder in the Bank of St. Louis. Now, however, Americans' first real depression, right? So eventually, Missouri will fall into American hands, right? America's first real depression hits in 1818, and the bank closes and he loses everything. What he would be able to pass on to his son, Stephen Fuller Austin, a boy at this time who would go on to become, quote unquote, the father of Texas, has been totally lost. After his failures in banking, Moses Austin's next move is to head down to San Antonio, which is still in Spanish hands, and he's going to go there with a number of Missourians to request a land grant. Now, the Spanish, as we know, have recently been dealing with some unwelcome Anglo intruders, let's say, called filibusters. Philip Nolan was one example we went over earlier. And initially, the Spanish told Austin to either leave or become a prisoner. However, an old friend living in the area, that's an old friend of Austin's, who had some sway in San Antonio, this friend helps, make an arrangement between Austin and the Spanish government. And the Spanish also conceive of a good use for these Anglo settlers. They could be a buffer zone between themselves, operating out of San Antonio, and the main subjects of this show, the Comanches. See, unlike other Spanish subjects, the Americans were armed, and they'd own their own land, and therefore have, a lot of stake in keeping that land safe. The land grant, it was thought, would also make these Anglo settlers loyal to the Spanish. That did not work out in the long run, as some may know. And they thought that these Americans might actually help stave off other Anglo incursions that were unsanctioned. So with all this in consideration, the Spanish end up granting Moses and his, followers some land. Unfortunately for Moses Austin, he would never get a chance to enjoy his own plot. On the way back to Missouri to recruit, even more settlers for his colony, he's robbed by bandits. They don't actually kill him, but he's stranded and he runs out of food, and he stumbles back into Missouri basically on his deathbed. And before he died in June of 1821, he begged his oldest son, Stephen Fuller Austin, to take up his mantle and head back to San Antonio and claim what was now his. Now, only a couple of months after Austin's death, New Spain becomes Mexico as a result for the Mexican War of Independence. Relevant for our story here is the diminished central authority in Mexico and what effect that had on the Mexicans and now, the Anglos in the north of this former New Spain. As a result of this lack of authority, Austin and his Tejanos are going to have to basically operate their own government and fend for themselves. And given the fact that these new settlers are going to be settling north of San Antonio, a place that is really untouchable by the new Mexican government in terms of, how they are able to manage this territory that ostensibly is theirs, the Austin colony will soon become acquainted with the Comanches, the real lords of this area. Now, something important to remember about this new community north of San Antonio is that these are really going to be small families or sometimes, extended kinship networks, and they're going to live in close-knit communities. And they're going to handle the policing of this territory themselves. And I think this adds a new element to our story when we put this community alongside the former inhabitants of this territory, which, for when the Spanish were in charge, were essentially just soldiers and priests and maybe some other government officials. Very few just normal citizens who are trying to carve out a plot of land which they could till themselves. I found a nice description of what I'm trying to get at here in Thomas Cutler's book, McCullough and the Frontier Military Tradition. And he quotes a number of early settlers there. He says the following, quote, "The first families," wrote the son of one of their number, Andrew Jackson Sowell, "were few in number and drawn closer together by their isolation. They were sociable, free-hearted, and respected, and they were ever ready to aid and assist those who needed it. They depended on each other in times of danger." End quote. Another early settler wrote that, quote, "I have friends, sincere devoted friends, whose purse strings are ever loose to me, and whose lives are even at my command, who respect me for what I am, not for any claims I have by birth, by family, or by friends." End quote. I can't help but get the sense that as we move into this narrative that is going to, tell the story of the interaction between the early Texans and the Comanches, I can't help but get the sense that revenge is going to play a big role in our story. And I think it's helpful to consider why. As I noted at the beginning of our show, I've basically intentionally downplayed the brutality of some of the situations here because I didn't think it added too much to our story. But here things change. For instance, how would you feel if your brother was scalped alive? That's what happened to J.W. Wilbarger's brother, who moved out to Texas in 1837. And his brother Josiah Wilbarger, he didn't actually die. He lived with this, what I guess you'd call a scar. There are pictures of Josiah Wilbarger's wound online as he lived on for, I think, about a decade after this. Or what if you watched your infant get his or her skull crushed thoughtlessly by a Comanche or a Karankawa warrior, as if it didn't matter at all? Or what if you watched a Texas Ranger do that to your son or daughter? What would you do? What would you be concerned about going forward in your life? I can't help but think that revenge would play a big role there. It might even lead someone to participate in the kinds of acts we've just described, all of which happened many times. And on the side of the Texans, this leads to a rather pitiless understanding of what must be done to the Amerindians in general, and maybe the Comanches specifically. J.W. Wilbarger, who I just mentioned, wrote a huge book cataloging all of the instances of what he called Indian depredations, right? His book was called, I think, Indian Depredations in Texas, which is a cataloging of all of these events. Here's how he described the general attitude in Texas towards the Amerindians. Quote, "In our opinion, the Aborigines of the American continent, pure and simple, were all naturally incapable of progress, and that their existence was only intended to be a temporary one, and that it should cease as soon as their places could be filled by a progressive people, such as the Anglo-Saxon race." End quote. Another early settler, John Joel Glanton, a name you might be familiar with as one of the main and rather laconic characters from Cormac McCarthy's novel Blood Meridian. He was a real person and a real settler, and he has a somewhat similar story. Lipan Apaches kidnapped his wife after killing some older women and children living nearby, and Glanton and some other Texans set out after the Lipans, and they actually tracked them down. But during the ensuing skirmish, it said that Glanton's wife is scalped and then tomahawked, and she dies there, left behind for Glanton to find. According to Samuel Chamberlain, who knew and, we'll say, worked with Glanton, this changed him. This is from Samuel Chamberlain's My Confessions, Recollections of a Rogue. Quote, "From this tragic scene, Glanton returned a changed man. He would often absent himself from the village, and when he returned, he invariably brought fresh scalps. He always raised the hair of his slain, and rumor gave him the credit of being the owner of a mule load of these barbarous trophies, smoke-dried in his lonely hut on the Guadalupe River. He drank deeply and sought the companionship of the most hardened desperados of the frontier. In all Indian fights, he was the devil incarnate." End quote. For those who actually have read Blood Meridian, you know what Glanton got up to. That book is based on an actual historical event, a lot of which seems to have been sort of taken from this Samuel Chamberlain book, My Confession. Glanton was hired to be a professional scalper. He would bring in Apache scalps for $50, $100, $150, depending on the nature of the scalp, whether it was from a woman or a child or a warrior. And eventually Glanton decides it's very difficult to tell where a scalp actually comes from, and he starts scalping the very citizens whose taxpayer money is funding his expedition. He starts scalping Mexicans living in northern Mexico. Now, it might not be fair to say that because some horrible thing has been done to you, you then have a license to treat other people this way, of course. But it does clarify why maybe some of these people behave the way they do, at least in my opinion. Now, while the Texans might be on the receiving end of a bit of culture shock here, which might in turn motivate their revenge, for the Comanches, this kind of behavior is simply what's done. It's how your father lived, it's how your grandfather lived, and it's how you hope to live. It's actually how you're going to gain your honor by treating other people this way. This was normal. And on this note of revenge that we're touching on here, the Comanches, in all the books I've read about them for the most part, note that the Comanches specifically take revenge seriously themselves. Despite the fact that this is sort of normal behavior on the plains, the Comanches are also touched when their loved ones are killed and mutilated, of course. Now, the Comanches, due to their overall fearsome reputation, are sometimes considered the most brutal torturers amongst the Amerindian tribes. I don't really think that's credible at all, given what I've read. But the Comanches do, when revenge is at stake, they put a little extra effort in. This is noted by Stanley Noyes, author of Los Comanches. He said the following, quote, "Taking revenge for the death, say, of a relative killed by an enemy, was a near sacred personal duty. Any offense committed by another tribe against the people, that is the Comanches, called for a group retaliation and was almost certain to initiate warfare. Each family who lost a man to the enemy had its own personal feud with the foe, until one of its war parties took an enemy scalp." End quote. There is a story that gets at this issue of the Comanche behavior when they feel like they've been wronged, when they're looking for revenge. This story is related by a former Mexican captive of the Comanches, and it goes as follows, quote, "A war party from his band attacked a rancho in Mexico, quickly killing all the defenders except for one man, a big, powerful Mexicano who fought with an axe. In the struggle, he managed to kill one or two of his assailants. A warrior finally subdued him by standing on a wall, tossing a lariat over his head, and jerking him off his feet. The raiders returned with the man to Comancheria. On the way, they treated him well, flattering him about his courage, and promising to make a chief of him when they returned to their camp. Crossing the Llano Estacado, they stopped by a watering hole for several days, where they put the prisoner to work digging a hole, telling them they needed it for a religious ceremony. When the captive, using a knife in his hands, had completed digging a pit of about 5 feet in depth, they bound him with rope, placed him in it, and filled the hole with dirt, packing it around his body and exposing his head. They then scalped him and cut off his ears, nose, lips, and eyelids. Leaving him bleeding, they rode away, counting on the sun and insects to finish the work for them." End quote. And if you think the Comanche men are tough, just wait for what the women get up to. This is noted in nearly every source that touches on this subject. Jean-Louis Berlander is a good example here. He stated that the Comanche women were responsible for, quote, "the largest portion of the nation's barbarity," that is, the Comanche nation's barbarity, and that they were, quote, "infinitely more cruel and ferocious than the men." He also mentions that they took, quote, "a particular delight in torturing the adult male prisoners." Fehrenbach notes this also, quote, "Most observers reported that the women were far more patient and vicious tormentors than the males. The females destroyed the captive by the most drawn-out and hideous means they could devise. They cut off his fingers, peeled his eyes, they stretched his tongue and charred his soles, and they invariably devoted fiendish attention to his penis and testicles." End quote. Now, if you're a Texas Ranger or part of some other Texas militia, and your job is to kill Comanches, how could this reality not possibly be on your mind all the time? To know that there is a likely fate worse than death that you could meet. Or even if you're just a farmer living in Texas now, consider the options here if your farm is raided. Best case scenario, you lose a horse or a mule. Right? It's not that every raid includes a death. In fact, many don't. But it's completely plausible that all your working animals will be taken, and any cows or other animals will be killed. That would crush your family's ability to feed itself, much like what the Comanches themselves were facing as these new Texan families drive off the buffalo, I should add. Now, let's say it's a more violent raid. Well, the babies will be killed, probably quickly and thoughtlessly. Younger children, they might actually have the best option. And this even seems horrific. 7, 8, 9-year-olds, maybe all the way up to 12 and 13-year-olds, those who can't really put up too much of a fight, they might be incorporated into the tribe, really kidnapped. But what exactly does that mean to be incorporated into the tribe? For the girls of this age, it all means they'll be abused, sometimes horribly by the women of the tribe, and then enslaved to some degree or another. And eventually, you might get the chance to be sold back. Or you could grow up and potentially marry a warrior. There's a famous instance of this, of a white captive from Texas actually marrying a famous chief in the Comanches. For the boys of this age, it's kind of similar, but you had to prove yourself as a potential fighter if you had any chance of actually being incorporated into the tribe as a full person and not just be used as a slave. Originally, I wanted to touch on the story of Herman Lehman, a boy taken by the Apaches at 11, who eventually joins the Comanches. Um, there's a lot of interesting detail there, but it would just take too long to lay out the full story and have it make sense. But let's just say there is one thorough account of what it's like for an 11-year-old Texan boy to be initiated into a Plains tribe, and it's an ordeal, let's just say. Now, older girls, teenagers, young women taken by the Comanches, they would be raped, enslaved, and then probably married into the tribe to some degree or another. They could also be sold back, of course, which would be the best case scenario. And as we've noted, if you're an adult male and you're not killed in combat, well, like I said, we've already touched on what you're likely going to face. And it should be noted that, of course, this was done between the tribes. After Fehrenbach tells in his book of how the Comanche women are the worst torturers, he talks about what men do to other, in this case, Tonkawas, who are deeply hated by the Comanches. We'll have one more sort of example here of what we're getting at before we get back to the narrative. Fehrenbach says the following, quote, "A Spanish recorded description of the mass torture of a number of captured Tonkawas is enough to show why the subject of torture was always close to the minds of the white settlers on the Amerindian frontier. In this case, the Comanche warriors staked out their victims and began applying fire to each captive's hands and feet until the nerves had been destroyed in each extremity. Then they amputated their ruined extremities and began the fire torture again against the new, sensitive, bleeding flesh. All the victims were scalped alive so that they would know the full extent of their degradation. Finally, tiring of the business, the Comanches tore out the Tonkawas' tongues to silence their cries. They heaped the writhing victims' scrota and bellies with blazing coals. The Comanches then went to sleep around the torture fires." End quote. So with all that being said, it might be interesting to consider that while the early Anglos moving into Texas will certainly meet hostile Amerins right away. In fact, we have some reports of early settlers on the wagon roads in finding skeletons along the sides of the roads. This isn't going to be a result of clashes with Comanches. In fact, the first tribe that actually gives these settlers problems are the Karankawas. Now, the Karankawas are known for being basically hostile towards everyone. They operate out of East Texas. That hostility actually, from what I've seen, seems to be a trait of some of these East Texas tribes. The Tonkawas come to mind as well. The Karankawas are known for smearing themselves with alligator grease. They're reported to be quite tall, good hunters, interested in seafood. But actually, it's going to be against this tribe that the Texas Rangers are first assembled, a group that we are soon going to be fully acquainted with. The early contacts between the Tejanos and Comanches actually seems to show signs of cooperation. There's always going to be horse raiding going on in the background, but we have many early reports of some effective trade between these two groups. And the famous Texan James Bowie is reported to have basically been saved by a couple of Comanches while he's traveling between San Antonio and that region we keep referring back to time and time again, the San Saba. Along with Bowie, Stephen F. Austin spends some time with the Comanches. He's actually taken prisoner by them, but he's let go without really any harm done. The early Texans bought horses from Comanches, something you need in this expansive country. Many of the horses that the early Texans end up buying from Comanches appear to be those stolen from Mexico. This gives me an opportunity to, maybe bring up one of my favorite Comanche sayings, which is that they allowed the Mexicans to live to their south and exist to raise Comanche ponies. Comanches didn't see much use for ponies and thought them to be quite a nuisance, it seems. But maybe this gives us a chance to hit on what's actually happening in Mexico that could also explain why the Comanches sort of don't seem too hostile to the Texans, at least initially. The early days of this new country that was once New Spain, the early days of Mexico are, well, let's say disorderly, especially in the north. The government down in Mexico City now really doesn't have the kind of bureaucratic arm necessary to control the territory to their north. To put it simply, when the Mexicans gained their independence from Spain, they simply were unable to protect their northern borders. Or maybe it's better to say that they were just worse at protecting those borders than the Spanish were because, as we've noted, the Spanish were never really able to figure it out in northern Spain either. I have an entire book here called War of a Thousand Deserts by Brian DeLay, where he just describes the absolute horrors going on in northern Mexico as a result of the Comanche and Apache raids. Well, that book I think is mostly concerned with Comanches, but the Apaches are also inspiring the early Mexican government to take some extreme measures against them. That's the government that hires John Joel Glanton, who we mentioned earlier. And before Glanton, they hired a man named James Kirker to essentially perform the exact same duties. That is, bringing in Apache scalps. So it's important to remember that while we're going to be focusing on what's going on with the Texans, this whole time the Mexicans are facing a much worse situation as far as their interactions with Amerindians. Now, the reputation of the Comanches was a bit uncertain amongst the Texans. There seems to be some evidence that the early Texans did not take them too seriously. They immediately recognized they're very talented atop a horse, but they didn't think that they really could bring the fight to the Texans in a way that would matter much. This is basically how David Burnett, an early Texan, described the Comanches. Excellent horsemen, but unlikely to pose any real military threat to this incoming tide of settlers. However, you'd think the Texans would figure out that just the very fact that the Spanish were unable to claim this territory for themselves should be an indication that the Comanches were quite formidable. And maybe we can just throw in here that the Anglo-Texans are not the only newcomers here. There are other new arrivals from, what is now the United States, like the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles, Shawnees, all coming from the American Southwest and pouring into northern Texas and Oklahoma, of course, on the Trail of Tears. Their plight is pretty well recorded in American history, I think. But what's not often mentioned is that not only are they uprooted from their homelands, where they're moved to, they're basically thrown into this cauldron of violence where the Amerins with the highest level of the military capabilities and the frontiersmen with the highest level of military capabilities are all meeting. This is the land that they are sort of forced into. And as a result of this, sometimes it is just assumed that, these new tribes coming from the American Southeast just can't play ball in this territory. But in fact, they're actually probably better armed than the Comanches or the Apaches or the Kiowa or the Osages. They're probably better armed because they've been fighting against American militaries for decades and putting up a pretty good fight, it should be mentioned. So to think that these new tribes could not defend themselves in this new territory I think it'd be a mistaken assumption. Interestingly, these new tribes will bring in something that will call us back to the early days of the Comanches meeting the Spanish. They're going to be bringing in Black American slaves, roughly at least 5,000, it seems. And this will actually allow them to sort of settle in and sort of get into this trading market that we've spent a few episodes describing earlier. Hämäläinen, who's always economically oriented in his studies, he notes on this, quote, "The removed Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles had brought with them approximately 5,000 black slaves, and the bondage institution persisted in Indian territory. This created markets for Comanche slaves, who now commanded extensive raiding domains in Texas and northern Mexico. The slave traffic offered multiple opportunities for its practitioners. Removed Indians purchased kidnapped Mexicans, Anglo-Americans, and black slaves from Comanches, either to augment their own labor force or to resell them to American Indian agents who generally ransomed the offered captive, especially if they had fair skin. Occasionally, Comanches even kidnapped black slaves from Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Creeks, and then sold them to Delawares, Kickapoos, and Shawnees. They also captured black runaway slaves from Indian territory and incorporated them into their ranks." End quote. And while we're on the subject of trade and wealth generally, it's a good time to point out that Comanche society has become a much more hierarchical society than it once was. This is not all that surprising considering the wealth boom that the Comanches have experienced, but it might, make the kind of situation for a young warrior in Comanche society a bit more dangerous, right? If your wealth and honor are both attached to how many horses you can take on a raid, well, you might start taking risks that you wouldn't have in the past. One historian of the kind of borderlands, let's say, Texas and Mexico, Joaquin Revilla Martinez, he published a paper basically making the argument that the explanation for Comanche raids can't be taking captives alone. Because if that were the case, how do you explain the Comanche losses on these raids? The Comanches are losing so many warriors on these raids that they're really not even replacing them with the captives they take themselves. So the other explanation is really they're going for wealth, right? And sometimes revenge, right? That's always going to be a factor, especially once the Texans start striking out into Comancheria. Fehrenbach kind of takes this line at some point as well. He says the following, quote, "Their war drives were not only economically motivated. They bred horses, and so had all the mounts they needed to hunt buffalo. They continued raiding, however, because for all its apparent looseness and male democracy, Comanche society had turned into a tightening hierarchy of prestige. Men gained prestige only through war exploits, and above all, by leading other men into battle. It was not only accidental that by this time Comanche war chiefs always gave away the booty that fell to them from their war raids. Most chiefs already held hundreds of fine horses, but no chief ever had enough prestige." End quote. And I think this is some good background if we're going to understand why the Comanches are going to be at times willing to take on the losses that will see them suffer. As we start to get back into the kind of Texas narrative here, the Texans by April of 1836 have basically won their Revolutionary War, right? And they have become the Republic of Texas by this point after the battle at San Jacinto, or at least, they're on their way there. By this point, the encroachment into Comancheria and the accompanying driving off of the buffalo, along with this motivation to gain horses that are now within easy reach for most Comanches, at least the southern ones. But as we know, the northern ones are not gonna they're not gonna be put off from going after horses just because they're hundreds of miles away. So by this point in the mid 1830s, the hostilities between the Texans, who now number in the 8,000 range, the hostility between them and the Comanches begins to really kick off. Returning to Fehrenbach, he says the following, quote, "In the 1830s, what was then West Texas became a bloody ground, filled with pioneer families who had lost fathers and sons, wives and daughters, who had buried their mutilated dead and ransomed young women who returned with demented stares." End quote. To say that in the 1830s, the situation between the Comanches and the Texans heated up is a bit of an understatement. S.C. Gwynn describes what happens at the Parker Fort in 1836 as basically the kickoff to what is a 40-year war between the Americans or the Texans, however you want to split the difference there, and the Comanches. And it begins at this fairly small fort on the edge of this Texan push west. This is probably one of the most famous raids, perhaps in all of American history, in terms of Amerind raids onto, American settlements. But it's a rather small-scale raid compared to even ones that we're going to address in this show. But it's famous for a number of reasons. First, it's a brutal raid. The sheer brutality and the firsthand accounts that come out of this raid will make it one that, works well in a book about this time period. The next reason is that if this raid had not occurred, one of the most famous chiefs in Comanche history, if not the most famous chief, would never have been born. And what I mean by that will become a bit more clear later on. Now, as I said, this will be a raid on the Parker Fort, which consists of the Parkers and then some vaguely related families. The Parkers had come from Virginia to Texas, And in 1834, they decided to move the boundaries of this European incursion into the West further than anyone had before. And they will pay a big price for that decision. Now, the Parker Fort was big, and the Parker family was big. As far as I can tell, there's at least 24 men, women, and children, ranging from infants to the elderly. And they're living in a couple of houses, maybe a few more than that. And these houses are skirted by a wall. Fehrenbach gives us some background on the Parker family specifically. Quote, "The Parker clan were hard-shell Baptists, members of a stern, puritanical Protestant sect who believed in hard work and a rigid morality, and they were dubious of any other route to heaven. They were farmers who thought that they had every right to come into this country." End quote. Maybe something else about the Parkers that's a bit interesting and adds some context here. Two of them were actually Texas Rangers at the time. Two of the earliest Texas Rangers, if we're getting specific here. Silas Parker and James Parker. Now, Silas was present for what follows, and so was James, but to me, it's not actually clear what James was up to, let's say, during the more violent parts of the following episode. But he was there, and it will shape his life deeply, as such tragedies did for many frontiersmen. Now, on May 19th, 1836, about a month after Texas won its independence, a party of 100 Amerins, mostly Comanches, but a few Wichitas and Kiowas who are along for the raid as well. This group of Amerins shows up outside the walls of this fort, ostensibly to trade. One of the Parker men, Benjamin Parker, refuses their request for a cow for the Comanches to butcher, and then goes back into the fort to tell the other men, what he thinks is up with these Amerins. They're not fools. They know that it's very likely that something extremely violent is about to unfold. Now, once he gives this message to some of the men who are nearby, he heads back out to try and get the Comanches to move along. And while the rest of the Parker group watches on, a couple of Comanches drive their lances clean through Benjamin Parker and then head for the gate to the fort. And it only gets worse. S.C. Gwynn has a rather lengthy description here of the grisly scene that unfolded. Quote, "Leaving Benjamin, the Indians turned and charged the fort. Rachel was already running with her son in her arms toward the back door. She was quickly caught. In her own detailed account, quote, 'A large skulky Indian picked up a hoe and knocked me down.' End quote. She fainted, and when she came to was being dragged by her long red hair, bleeding profusely from her head wound. I made several unsuccessful attempts to raise my feet before I could do it," she wrote. She was then taken to the main body of Indians, where she saw her uncle's mutilated face and body up close. She saw her son in the arms of an Indian on horseback. Two Comanche women began to beat her with a whip. "I suppose," Rachel recalled, "that it was to make me quit crying." End quote. Now, simultaneously, three of the Parker men, one of whom is the Ranger Silas Parker, are fighting the other Comanches around the fort, and as it would turn out, all of them would fight to their deaths. But they did not do so completely in vain. It did give some time for the eldest of the family, John Parker, and his wife Sally and their daughter Elizabeth. It at least gave them some time to attempt to escape. After killing off the men at the fort, the Comanches then take off after those attempting to flee. Gwynn picks up the narrative like this, quote, "Next, the warriors turned to a task especially suited to mounted, raiding Plains Indians, running down fleeing, screaming victims. Elder John Parker, his wife Sally, and their daughter Elizabeth Kellogg, a young widow, had managed to travel 3/4 of a mile when the Indians overtook them. All three were surrounded and stripped of all their clothing. One can only imagine their horror as they cowered stark naked before their tormentors on the open plain. The Indians then went to work on them, attacking the old man with tomahawks and forcing Granny Parker, who kept trying to look away, to watch what they did to him. They scalped him, cut off his genitals, and killed him, in what order no one will ever know. Then they turned their attention to Granny Parker, pinning her to the ground with their lances, raping her, driving a knife deep into one of her breasts, and then leaving her for dead. They threw Elizabeth Kellogg on a horse and took her away." End quote. Now, not all of the Parkers will lose their lives in this raid or be taken captive. A few do manage to escape. There's one group of escapees here I'll get into, and this involves Silas Parker's wife, the ranger who, by this point, has already been killed. Gwynn continues, quote, "In all the confusion, Silas Parker's wife, Lucy, and her 4 children had also run out the back gate of the fort in the direction of the cornfields. The Indians caught them too, forced Lucy to surrender 2 of her children, then dragged her, the 2 remaining children, and one of the men, a man named L.D. Nixon, back to the fort, where they were somehow rescued by 3 men from the cornfields who had arrived with rifles. The 2 children who remained in captivity were soon to become household names on the western frontier: Silas and Lucy Parker's blue-eyed 9-year-old daughter, Cynthia Ann, and her 7-year-old brother, John Richard." End quote. In the Parker Fort raid, the Comanches killed 5 men and 2 women, but not Granny Parker, who miraculously survived this ordeal. All in told, 5 are taken captive: the 17-year-old Rachel Parker Plummer, her 14-month-old baby. 7-year-old John Parker is also taken, along with Elizabeth Kellogg, who's in her 30s, and the 9-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker, who we just mentioned. Now, back to James Parker. It's unclear what he was up to exactly during the fight, but at some point, he helps lead a group of 6 adults and 12 children out of the fort, and then 65 miles away to what is now Palestine, Texas. And he has to basically deal with hunger and has to hide out, lest the Indians track them down too. That whole trip is quite the feat itself. Now, for the captives who are taken, they are facing a whole nother set of problems, right? There's the raid, but then there's the reality that you're now in the hands of hostile Plains Indians. On the ride back to camp, the women are repeatedly violated in full view of the other captives. All of them are severely beaten and starved of food, and it appears that Rachel Parker's baby likely dies early on in the trip somehow or another. Now, the Comanches don't come out of all of this unscathed, and not only from the fighting. Horrors were visited upon the Comanches in kind of a unique way here, and it actually sort of exemplifies the clashing of cultures taking place at the Parker Fort. While raiding the fort, I believe 4 Comanches come across a bottle of arsenic and are a bit confused about what it is, and end up concluding it is paint and start painting their faces and body with this sort of arsenic. Now, it's more than likely they died an agonizing death as a result of this. So a bit of something interesting to note about this raid that, as I said, demonstrates these 2 alien cultures meeting in central Texas. Now, John Parker would eventually be ransomed back to the Parker family in 1842, but he'd spent now, by this point, his formative years with the Comanches. He'd been 6 or 7 when he was taken, and now he was at least 12. And the transition back into European American society was unbearable for him, and he soon ran away back to the Comanches and simply never returned to Texan or European or American society, however you'd want to describe it. Cynthia Ann Parker would end up with the Quahatis, who perhaps by this point don't even actually exist. The Quahatis are this late-forming band that exists deep in the Llano Estacado and would become revered as the fiercest Comanche band on the frontier and known for sort of their remote dwellings, the fact that they lived so far away from basically anyone else. It gives them a bit of sort of like a mystical feel and sort of an aura that surrounds the Quahatis. So she ends up with them, and she would later give birth to Quanah Parker, possibly the greatest and certainly the most famous Comanche chief in history. Though Silas Parker died in the raid, as I said, his brother James ends up leading a party back to safety, and he would become a figure much like some of those I mentioned earlier. Like John Joel Glanton and James Wolbarger, this personal tragedy seems to shape the rest of his life. James Parker would go on to make a number of forays out into Indian country looking for his relatives. Many times he'd do this all alone, something that is seemingly begging for a terrible outcome. But given how Gwynn describes the way that James Parker carried himself the rest of his life after the Fort Parker raid, while going into Indian territory alone is a bit less surprising. Quote, "Like many other members of the Parker clan, James was a colorful figure, but he was much more than that. He was one of the most outrageous, extreme, obsessive, ambitious, violent, dishonest, morally compromised, reckless, and daring characters ever to stake their claim in the early East Texas frontier. He was a man of more contradictions than anyone could keep track of, a prominent citizen who was accused at various times of being a murderer, counterfeiter, liar, drunk, horse thief, and robber. And then a bit later, Gwynn continues, quote, he admitted to killing 5 people, but they were all Indians, and there were no criminal penalties in the Republic of Texas for murdering Redskins. And yet, that was not how James Parker was mainly known. For all the misadventure, he was famous throughout the West as a man who searched for the Parker captives, the man who refused to give up. He made 5 trips alone into Indian lands between 1836 and 1837, mostly acting on tips about young white women, like his daughter Rachel, who had been carried off by Indians. He made another 4 or 5 excursions from 1841 to 1844, based on information he believed would lead him to his niece Cynthia Ann Parker, his nephew John Parker, and his grandson James Pratt Plummer. He logged perhaps 5,000 miles, much of it alone. End quote. These encounters between the Texans and the Comanches, and the Amerinds generally, really brought out a level of barbarity and sort of baseness in the Texans that by this time in history was becoming unseemly in the diaspora of European culture anywhere else, or especially on the East Coast of the United States. What was going on in Texas was simply unlike anything that was happening in Europe, or even if you were to go a few hundred miles east from where this Parker Fort was, all of this was completely new and alien. But in some ways, it was not new. It was the reemergence of what happens in human societies at a certain phase. But the Europeans had already sort of gotten past this phase. But the Comanches had not. And that's not to degrade Comanche society at all. If you've listened this far, you must know how much respect I have for the Comanche culture and society and how capable I believe they are in many ways. And the fact that the Comanches were able to use a phrase I used earlier, play ball with the Europeans, I find stunning. And the only way for the Texans to match the Comanches was to sort of become more like them. Fehrenbach sort of hits on a similar point. Quote, the Indian Wars called up forces that could not be intellectually or ethically analyzed within accepted American parameters. The poetic, honorable Amerindian roasted his cultural foes to death over slow fires with apparent enjoyment. Many devoutly Christian and well-educated white men coldly shot fleeing Indian women or bashed out infants' brains with gun butts. The war between civilized whites and the barbaric Amerindians were carried out on the same levels as the conflicts among the Indians, and many whites never understood this inevitability. On the frontier, it was them or us, and they were killed so that we might live. In such wars, the defeated vanish in ignominy. The winners hold out neither hope nor generosity. End quote. And the kind of anguish that was experienced by the Texans was equally matched on the Amerindian side as well. To understand the kind of pain that these wars produced, we have to remember that some of the natives viewed defeat by the whites as a fate far worse than death. Now, there's a story I came across in Stanley Noyes' work, Los Comanches, the Horse People. Now, this story actually involves the Tawaconis, a close relative to the Wichitas, the Comanches' on and off allies. Now, in retaliation for a Tauconi raid and horse thieving, a group of Texans attack one of their villages in East Texas. And I'll leave the description of what happened after the Texans took some of the Tauconi prisoners to Noyes. He says the following, quote, one of these, he means one of the prisoners that the Texans have just taken, one of these, a woman, had with her a lively 3-year-old daughter. The little girl was bright and pretty, and the men paid much friendly attention to her. But one morning, after camping for the night on the Brazos River, they discovered to their horror that the child's mother had killed her with a knife. Afterwards, she had attempted to kill herself. General Burleson called for a volunteer to end her life. One, Oliver Buckman, stepped forward. Somehow moving the Tauconi woman to the riverbank, he drew a large hack knife he had made himself. While she stared straight into his eyes, he severed her head from her body with a single stroke. End quote. Despite all of this horror and bloodshed and tragedy, there are still some interesting moments, if not peace, that emerges between these two populations. The same author, Stanley Noyes, recounts a story of a group of surveyors in the mid 1840s who were found out near the San Saba River by a party of 50 or so Comanches. The Comanches could have easily slaughtered these surveyors, and the Comanches knew what the surveyors were doing by this point, it seems. They might not have known exactly how the surveying equipment worked, but they knew that men that came with these odd, tripods or whatever it was they were using to survey, they knew that these men were involved deeply in taking away the buffalo land that the Comanches cherished and had fought for generations to attain. Instead of killing them, the Comanches actually bring them along to their camp, a bit against their will, if we're being honest. But they bring these surveyors to a meeting with other Comanches, and at first these surveyors are simply convinced they're being led to their deaths, probably to some extended torture, one that we might have described earlier even. But as they're riding, the Comanches are simply interested in what exactly the surveying techniques are. Why exactly are these Texans marking the trees in these strange ways? And at some point, to their shock, one of the Comanches begins speaking English to them perfectly. And they quickly find out that this young warrior had been taken as a boy at 7 or 8 years old and had been incorporated into the tribe. And immediately, these Texan surveyors try to persuade him to return. To them, why would this, I would assume he's now a young man. Why would this young man prefer to live on the frontier in this sort of scarce environment when, you have a good Christian life waiting for you back in Texas? And to their astonishment, this now young Comanche is completely uninterested in returning to the Texan way of life. At least at that point, that is. Now, eventually it becomes clear this is a man named Warren Lyons. Eventually, Warren Lyons does defect from the Comanches back to, Texan society, and he even joins the Rangers, a group that, in the wake of the Parker Fort raid, is going to become more and more influential. I mean, as we said, Silas and James Parker were already part of the Ranger gang, I guess, as they were in the early days. But they would become formalized and, they'd become a much more influential group in terms of policing Texan society. For this, I have a source, Doug Swanson, who wrote the book Cult of Glory. He gives us a nice description of what the early Rangers were up to. Quote, "The ranging companies were not furnished with uniforms, insignia, or even horses or arms. Members had to provide these themselves. They were rarely paid, but rather were supported by the communities they protected. The early records are filled with settlers' complaints about Comanche raids, and also their complaints about the Rangers stealing chickens and killing hogs. The ranging companies emerged not as a true militia, a regular army, or a police force, but as semi-permanent shifting bands of irregulars. They were called into being by the needs of a bleeding frontier, by a society that could not organize or afford another kind of force. The early Texas Rangers were unique in the modern West experience, and therefore also difficult to describe. If analogies must be drawn, they were actually closer to the Amerindian war bands they fought than the advancing civilization they defended." End quote. That sort of gets at that point I made earlier that in its confrontation with the Comanches, the Texans will sort of become much like them. Now, there will be some tit-for-tat raiding and then responses from the Rangers for the next couple years, but things really begin to come to a head in 1840. It's right at the beginning of 1840, on January 9th, in San Antonio, the bells of the San Fernando Cathedral begin to toll, which announced the arrival of 3 Comanche chiefs. Now, it's interesting, these bells had been used to advise the townspeople that an attack was about to come from Comanches or Apaches, and that had been going on for nearly 100 years before the Texans ever arrived. But these 3 Comanche chiefs, all Penetecas, have come to talk peace with one Colonel Henry Carnes. Carnes informs them that a peace negotiation must begin with the Comanches returning their white captives. And Carnes means all of them, right? And these 3 Comanche chiefs appear to agree to these terms and then set off. Part of the reason that the Penetecas desired peace at this point had to do with a number of factors, but near the top of the list are increased hostilities with Apaches, always going on in the background, and another smallpox epidemic that has hit their band specifically. Now, before the Penteca return in March, Carnes will receive a message from Albert Sidney Johnson, who is the Secretary of War for the Republic of Texas at this point, and Johnston makes a couple of things clear. One, all Amerindian land was at this point forfeit to the Republic. There was no such thing as Amerindian land. It was Texan land. And his second point was that should the chiefs fail to bring back all their white captives, those chiefs would be taken as hostages. So that set the scene for what unfolded beginning on March 19th, 1840. 35 Penteca warriors with painted faces and feathered headdresses, along with a number of women and children, begin streaming into San Antonio atop their Spanish Mustangs. And they're led by a Penteca chief named Maguara. Maguara makes for an interesting figure. He actually hosted Ranger Noah Smithwick, who I think I've referred to a few times in this series. He hosted Smithwick at his camp a while back and spoke candidly about the situation that the white man's approach presented to the Comanches. Over a campfire, he told Smithwick, quote, "The white man comes and cuts down the trees, building houses and fences, and the buffaloes get frightened and leave and never come back, and the Indians are left to starve. Or, if we follow the game, we trespass onto the hunting grounds of other tribes, and war ensues. If the white man would draw a line, defining their claims, and keep on their side of it, the red man would not molest them." End quote. As diplomatic as this seems, it's also worth noting that Maguara is the leader of the very Penteca band who had perpetrated the Parker Fort raid that we just discussed. That's not to say that Maguara was necessarily present for that raid. So his Pentecas are not afraid of dusting it up and, bringing it to the white settlers. He and his tribe are both diplomatic, sensible, but brutal in their reprisals. And when it comes to reprisals and brutality, Maguara makes the mistake of bringing too much evidence of this back with him to San Antonio to this peace conference. The Pentecas who enter San Antonio in March to start hammering out a deal, they've brought beads and horses for trading, but crucially, they've only brought one white captive, and there's a problem with this white captive. Her name is Matilda Lockhart. She'd been taken by Comanches at the age of 13, but the effects of her time that she's spent in Comanche captivity was all too obvious for the residents of San Antonio who had all come out to watch these Amerins come into town. Mary Maverick is the wife of a local businessman at the time. She described what she saw. She said that Matilda Lockhart looked like this, quote, "Her head, face, and arms were full of bruises and sores, and her nose was actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, with a great scab formed on the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh." End quote. And as the Texans begin inspecting and questioning the girl, the full reality of her experience becomes clear, which I don't think at this point we have to reiterate. In addition, though, burns cover her entire body, even the soles of her feet, which might have been done to prevent her from escaping. S.C. Gwynn gives a little more context here. Quote, "She said she had been tortured by the Comanche women. It was not just her face that had been disfigured. Her entire body bore scars from fire. The Comanches were completely oblivious of the effect this would have on the Texans. Many of the latter were familiar with tortures practiced by eastern tribes, such as the Choctaws, Cherokees, which included the use of fire. But it was almost always practiced on men. Those tribes rarely abducted, raped, and tortured white women, as the Plains tribes did." End quote. Now, with that being said about Matilda Lockhart's condition, what's about to happen isn't strictly, about that. While Matilda Lockhart's condition definitely might have inflamed the Texan tempers here, what's about to unfold was already set in motion with Albert Sidney Johnson's directions that, look, if they don't bring back all the white captives, you're going to take these chiefs hostage. Well, it's thought that at least, a dozen, 24 white captives are with the Comanches. Could be even more. So when talks soon begin at the local courthouse, it seems that the fate of the Comanches might have already been set in stone by this point. The Texans openly ask where are these other captives? Maguire, through a translator who himself, this translator, was a former Comanche captive. So this translator will, understand what the Comanches are about. Maguire replied that he didn't have any power over the bands that held those other captives, but he said that, they probably could be ransomed, but for a high price, some ammunition, blankets. But Maguire concluded with, how do you like that answer? Colonel William Fisher, who was a Texan that was a part of the negotiations, said through the translator the following, quote, I do not like your answer. I told you not to come here again without bringing in your prisoners. You have come against my orders. Your women and children may depart in peace. When those prisoners are returned, he's referring to the white prisoners, your chiefs here present may likewise go free. Until then, we hold you as hostages. End quote. Now, the interpreter initially refuses to actually translate this message, knowing that Maguire and his warriors are likely not going to take this lying down and a fight is almost certainly going to commence. But Fisher pressed the matter, and the interpreter, sort of as we're told in the sources, moves closer to the door and then tells the Comanches what the Texans' intentions are. S.C. Gwynn, he describes what happens next. Quote, the soldiers closed ranks. Maguire, who had got to the door first, drew his knife and stabbed a soldier. Then the soldiers opened fire, dropping Maguire and the other Indians as well as several of their own people. They fired again. The room was filled with noise and smoke and blood and ricocheting rifle balls. One soldier, Matthew Old Paint Caldwell, took a stray bullet in the leg. Hobbled, he grabbed a musket from one of the chiefs, blew his head off, then used it to bludgeon another Indian to death. The fight spilled outside, and now a full-scale Hollywood-style melee erupted in the plaza. The Indians who had waited outside, men, women, and children, turned on the onlookers, many of whom were armed, and the fighting spread. People who saw it said the Indian women and boys fought just as hard as the men. One Indian boy shot a district judge through the heart with a toy arrow, killing him, but the Comanches never really had a chance. Though it started as a street fight, it turned quickly to a massacre. End quote. The Texans would chase many of the Comanches, women, children, and any remaining warriors to a nearby river, and many would be killed there trying to cross. Some remaining warriors in the town who'd locked themselves inside of various dwellings would be burned out, only to be shot as they exited. In total, the Pennateca Comanches have just lost 30 of their warriors, 3 women and 2 children total. 32 more have been taken prisoner. The Texans, they've lost 7 killed and 10 wounded, and we're told that the only available surgeon, he works through them, throughout the night, while the Comanches are left in agony with their injuries, rather unsurprisingly. Now, from a purely tactical standpoint, consider what the Texans have just done. They've made a huge blunder. While knowing that there are at least 15 plus white captives in Comancheria, they have just killed 30 warriors at a peace conference. What would result from this blunder was yet another atrocity, one we know about only because a young captive in Comancheria, Brooker Webster, he actually witnessed what was about to unfold, and he described it when he eventually returned. Webster related that the Pennateca Comanche women, after learning of what had happened, they practiced some self-mutilation, which we see whenever one of these sort of mass tragedy events occurs. And according to Webster, some of the women caused their own deaths during this self-mutilation event. But once they're done with that, they turn on the captives they have. Fehrenbach describes the scene as follows, quote, they were tortured to death, one by one. The children and young women were pegged out naked beside the campfire. They were skinned, sliced, and horribly mutilated, and burned alive by vengeful women, determined to wring out the last shriek and convulsion from their agonized bodies. Matilda Lockhart's 6-year-old sister was among these unfortunates, who died screaming under the High Plains moon. He later adds, quote, when the moon set over the charred corpses, there could never again be peace between the Comanches and the Texans. End quote. Now, in the past, when the Comanches had been either suffering military defeats, whether at the hands of the Spanish or the Osages or some other neighboring tribe, or when they've had to deal with smallpox epidemics, we've seen them take a very calculated approach. And we have to remember that the reason why the Penetecas initially came in for these peace talks was partially related to both those factors: wars with the Apaches and a smallpox epidemic. Surprisingly, here, though, the Comanches will maybe not take the most calculated approach. We see a month after the Council House fight, we see a band of Penetecas show up outside San Antonio, trying to coax the Texans into a fight. Now, interestingly, in this instance, Colonel Fisher, who had performed the negotiations with the Comanches back at the Council House fight, he's actually not in command. He's still recovering from a wound he sustained at the Council House fight, and he's left command of San Antonio in the hands of Captain William Davis Redd. Possibly wisely, William Davis Redd declines the Comanche sort of offer to do battle. And as a result, one of his lieutenants calls him a coward. This is a man named Lysander Wells. This leads to a duel, which takes place in San Antonio, and both of the men shoot each other dead. Now, the effects of the Council House fight do not end there. In fact, still in the year of 1840, they will dip down south into Texas and will launch the greatest raid Amerindians ever perpetrated on the settlers. And this will occur almost certainly in revenge for the Council House fight. It's the Penetecas again. This is what causes Doug Swanson to call the Council House fight, or at least the way it was handled by the Texans, quote, perhaps the greatest strategic blunder by Anglo-Texans in the Indian Wars, end quote. Now, as we said, it will take the Comanches, the Penetecas specifically, a few months to recover. It's important to remember that not only did they lose 30 or so men, these were all warriors and the kind that they would bring into a peace conference. So probably some of the more important leaders of that Peneteca band. But in early August, the Comanches will mobilize under a Peneteca chief, and I'm going to take my best shot at this name, Patsanaquahip, otherwise known as Buffalo Hump. He was described by Texas pioneer John Holland Jenkins as, quote, a magnificent specimen of savage manhood, end quote. What Buffalo Hump will pull off here, as I said, is the greatest Indian raid ever. In August, as I said, he leads 400 warriors out of the Texas Hill Country. And there could have been just as many women helping this war party and serving as some kind of logistical support. As we'll see, they'll basically have a supply train heading home once they're done. And in general, women coming along for a raid is not all that unusual. So it's really no surprise that a historically large raid like this one will, call for, at least the help of some women. Now, the party first follows the Guadalupe River, which runs between Austin and San Antonio, and they take it east towards Victoria, Texas. The Comanche party will kill their first victim east of San Antonio. They basically just come across two travelers on the road, and one that they had thought they'd killed actually ends up surviving. The other attempts to flee and is caught, lassoed, dragged around for a bit, then had the soles of his feet cut off. And then the Comanches seem to make him walk around for a bit and then shoot him dead. Now, Ben McCullough is a Texas Ranger who's going to play a big role here. At the time, he's actually wearing a sling around one of his arms because he'd just been in a duel with another Ranger and got shot. But despite this injury, Ben McCullough organizes a party of about 24 Rangers, and they head out to confront the Comanches. Soon another few dozen men will join as they're sort of on their way. Now, a man named John Coffee Hayes, who is probably the most famous Texas Ranger of the 19th century, if we're being honest, probably the most famous Ranger of all time, he joins McCullough's company, and the two of them will ride their horses, quote, almost to death, spreading word of the raid, end quote. So it's a company of Rangers and soon some Texas militiamen. These are men who probably had fought in the earlier Texas engagements with the Mexicans. They will start forming a larger and larger group, and together they all head out from Gonzales, Texas, it's east of San Antonio, and search for the warpath that the Comanches are taking and eventually find it. Now, it's not that hard to find the path, we have to remember, because we have 400 Comanche warriors, maybe as many women and children, They might have taken more than one horse each. So they're creating a path that is a bit more distinguishable than some of these smaller Comanche raids that they'd been engaging in so far. So the Comanches are not going to be nearly as elusive during this raid as they're used to being. Also, the number of men and women that are on for the raid is going to make the stealth at which they're used to proceeding in a much more difficult thing to accomplish. After a Comanche raid, it's typical that they basically go day and night for maybe 2 or 3 days without stopping. And that is so they really clear themselves out from the territory that they've just, stolen from or killed in. But they're not going to really be able to do this because of how many men and women are along for the raid. Now, McCullough's men soon run into another group of Rangers led by one John Tomlinson. And soon after this, it's not totally clear when, but I think right around the same time period, they also pick up some Tonkawa scouts who are going to be very helpful in tracking down the Comanches. But still, despite the size of this Comanche force, the Rangers are still pretty far behind them. It seems like at least a day or so, at least initially. At first, the Comanches are hitting small settlements, they're killing and looting and moving on. But around August 7th, they're creeping closer and closer to Victoria, Texas. A large town, by any metric, at least in Texas in the early 19th century. They first encounter slaves working in the fields outside the town and begin killing them. Fehrenbach describes the Victoria scene as follows, quote, "Whooping warriors appeared out of the blue, taking the settlement by complete surprise and cutting down several luckless inhabitants on the outskirts. They killed a number of black slaves working in the fields. Had they ridden immediately into town and been prepared to hunt down the whites on foot, there is little question that their hundreds could have slaughtered the entire population. But as always, this was not the Comanche way. The people of Victoria stayed behind cover while the Comanches mutilated the corpses of the dead, speared cattle, and rode around the outskirts in screeching triumph. The warriors kept this up all day and kept the town surrounded through the night. Then, on the 7th, when Buffalo Hump persuaded some of his men to ride into the streets, attacking and setting fire to the houses, the townspeople opened up with blistering fire from the roofs and windows. Quickly losing stomach for the house-to-house search, the warriors retreated, driving off 2,000 mules and horses. One group of Mexican traders in the town lost 500 head, and the Comanches had killed 15 people at Victoria." End quote. The Comanches then hit Linville, Texas the next day. Linville was not particularly a large town, but it was important for another reason. It was something like a shipping depot, and there were just stores of goods in Linville. This is going to be exactly what the Comanches want. As we kind of noted, the Comanches are not there to slaughter the entire town, because it seemed like they could have done that if they had just ridden right in, right? According to Fehrenbach, if they hadn't wasted their time in the fields killing the slaves and killing the cattle outside Victoria, they probably could have taken Victoria by surprise and devastated the population there. But Fehrenbach says the following of Linville, quote, "The Comanches found few victims in Linville, but they uncovered a different sort of bonanza. John Lynn's warehouse was packed with goods awaiting shipment to San Antonio. Bolts of red cloth, boxes of fashionable stovepipe hats, umbrellas, and assorted ladies' finery." End quote. Now, all of this creates a rather odd scene. What the Comanches have just raided, they'll wear. And John Lynn, the man whose warehouse has just been looted, describes this as a Saturnalia, which is a reference to an ancient Roman religious festival. John Lynn says the following, quote, "These Indians made free and went dashing about the blazing village, amid their screeching squaws and little Injuns, like demons in a drunken Saturnalia, with Robinsons," that's another local merchant, "with Robinsons' hats on their heads and Robinsons' umbrellas bobbing about on every side, like tipsy young balloons." End quote. Gwynn picks up the narrative like this, quote, "After burning the town, which was so thoroughly destroyed that it was never rebuilt, the Comanches departed heading back the way they had come. If their antics in the town seemed like a bad dream, what happened next suggested a full-scale hallucination. The truth was that Buffalo Hump had lost control of his army. Vengeance had dissolved into something that more closely resembled pure fun. The Comanches had arrived in town in buckskins and breechcloth. They left wearing stovepipe hats, high leather boots, and expensive pigeon-tailed coats with bright brass buttons worn backwards and buttoned up from behind. They had taken the calicos and bright ribbons from the warehouse and festooned their lances with them and plaited them into the tails of their horses. End quote. The Comanches have done excellently so far in this raid. They've managed to sack 2 towns with valuable stores of goods and cattle, but it's here that they will make a crucial mistake. They end up taking a rather predictable route home. Now, Comanche retreats, as we said, usually include a multi-day dash, but they're going to be moving very slowly, and this whole time the Rangers have been trailing them. At this point, the Rangers are just arriving in Victoria to find the wreckage left behind by the Comanches, and they're able to pick up some motivated help from there as well. Men who have just watched their town get half burned down join the Ranger company. On August 9th, Tomlinson's Rangers get a glimpse of the Comanches, and I think here the description from Doug Swanson is worth quoting. Quote, on August 9th, Captain Tomlinson's forces neared the Comanche train on a broad prairie near Linville. A war party rode out to meet them. Here the Texans found a spectacle none had seen before, a sight both ludicrous and chilling. With the loot from their raids, the Indians were, in W.D. Miller's appalling description, quote, hideously bedaubed after their own savage taste, end quote. One mounted warrior wore a stovepipe hat and carried an umbrella. Another donned a long-tailed coat, worn backwards and buttoned down from behind. They seemed to have a talent for finding and blending the strangest, most unheard-of ornaments, Ranger John H. Jenkins wrote. It was a strange spectacle never to be forgotten, the wild, fantastic band as they stood in battle array. Some had fastened racks of antlers to their heads. One wore headdresses that struck me particularly, Jenkins recalled. It consisted of a large crane with red eyes, end quote. So in front of this dressed-up, company of Comanches, the Texans will dismount from their horses and then watch the Comanches encircle them, atop their mounts still. But ultimately, only a small skirmish ensues. It seems like, the Comanches that stood to fight here were really just trying to buy time for this large group of Comanches to get some more distance, right? This might have just been a rearguard action to sort of hold off the Texans for a bit longer. So fairly quickly, this rearguard action peels off and makes its way back towards this large group of Comanche warriors lumbering back up north. The Rangers, traveling quicker, given their numbers, catch up fairly soon, and they even send a few Rangers up ahead to try and start taking pot shots, or maybe even more accurate shots than that, at this group of horsemen heading north. But one of the Rangers is quickly shot down, and the Rangers sort of peel back, but of course continue the pursuit. By August 12th, now we're a couple days after this first encounter, the Rangers are racing in sight of the Comanches again. So they're sort of closely trailing this big group, but don't really quite understand how to handle it yet. But they're going to have to make a decision soon because the Texan horses are starting to die. They're exhausted, they're dehydrated, and they're falling off, and if not actually dying, they're slowing down considerably. And it's likely that the Comanches are probably facing some similar issues as well, because in the wake of this movement north, the Rangers are finding all of the refuse that is being left behind, basically the loot that they'd taken from Linville and Victoria. So they're finding, what the Comanches are willing to ditch. They're also finding some mules that have been shot, likely for lagging behind. So the Rangers and Comanches are both facing the realities of the climate and what it's like to get into a long pursuit over the course of multiple days in August in Texas. Now, pretty soon, I think on this August 12th date, the Rangers decide that they pretty much know the route that the Comanches are telegraphing here. And they think that the route that the Comanches are taking north is going to bring them past a place called Plum Creek. And the Rangers decide to try and swing around this Comanche horde and meet them at Plum Creek, ready to fight. The Rangers soon find themselves at Plum Creek prior to the Comanche arrival. And about a day later, they begin to see the dust on the plain being kicked up by this 7-mile-long column of Comanche warriors. Here, the Rangers decide to dismount once again, a mistake that they will refrain from making in the future. Most of the Comanches, again, simply just go around the Ranger column, as they had earlier. The Comanches see no need to stand and fight with all of their men. Their goal, as always, is not really killing, it's looting, right? So they are really concerned with getting their loot home, and they're going to stand up a few warriors, of course, to fight the Rangers, but it's not like you're going to see every male in this Comanche raid stand and fight here. But, of course, many do. Now, it's a little bit hard for me to tell from the sources, but it seems as if at least some large part of the Comanche party that is meeting the Texans at Plum Creek to fight are sort of hiding out in the woods nearby. And here the Rangers decide to take a different posture towards fighting the Comanches. They decide to get back on their horses and charge the Comanche line in the woods. Here we'll return to Doug Swanson for his description on what followed. Quote, "Whooping and firing, McCullough, his Rangers, and other Texans crashed into the Comanche lines. The Indians retreated, and the Texans pursued them in a running fight that lasted at least 10 miles. Many of the Indians' horses and mules became stuck in the muddy creek bed. They bogged down so close together that a man could have walked along their bodies, dry," Jenkins wrote. One Comanche warrior's head was, quote, "nearly blown off," Ranger Robert Hall said. Though dead and stiff, he remained on his war horse. The horse galloped over the battlefield, the headless body still on it, before vanishing into the woods. End quote. The Rangers here defeat this Comanche contingency pretty thoroughly. They end up taking 30 men, women, and children as prisoners. These were turned over to the Tonkawa scouts who had come along for this counteroffensive, likely to get an opportunity to mete out some revenge on the Comanches, and they'll make use of these prisoners for just that purpose. Returning to Swanson, he says the following of this group of Comanche prisoners, quote, "They were turned over to their bitter enemies, the Tonkawas, who had provided vital help to the Rangers and volunteers in the battle. The Tonkawas, quote, retired with the prisoners about a mile above us," Ranger Nichols wrote, ominously, "and had a big scalp dance that night. Among its highlights, much vocal celebration of victory and ritual consumption of the vanquished foe. Our allies were cooking a Comanche warrior," Ranger Hall recalled. "They cut him into slices and broiled him on a stick. They danced, raved, howled, and sang, and invited me to get up and eat a slice of Comanche. They said it would make me brave. I was very hungry, but not sufficiently so to become a cannibal." End quote. At least one Texan at Plum Creek spends the aftermath of the battle walking amongst the dying and cutting throats. And at one point, he jabs his knife into the chest of a still alive Comanche woman and, quote, "twisted it round and round like he was grinding coffee. Someone asked the Texan how he could have done such a thing to a human being. Quote, 'They ain't human,' he said. 'That's an Injun, and I'd come to kill Injuns.' That incident left Nichols with an epiphany. Quote, 'The American race is not wholly exempt from acts of cruelty and barbarism.' End quote. According to Ranger Noah Smithwick, who we keep returning to, the Great Raid was so psychologically shocking to the Texans that there was even some debate about moving the capital of Texas away from Austin. Of course, there could have been a political angle there as well, but we cannot underestimate how impactful this 1840 event was. And the killings would not stop there. Smithwick, in his book, The Evolution of a State, picks up our narrative describing what occurred after Buffalo Hump's Great Raid and the massacre at Plum Creek. Quote, "Hoping to put a lasting quietus on the tribe, President Lamar determined to follow up the victory at Plum Creek by dispatching Colonel Moore with 100 men, including 12 Lipan Apaches, to find and rout them," he means the Comanches, "from their lair, which was located on the Red Fork of the Colorado. The expedition was entirely successful, the camp being burned and the occupants indiscriminately slaughtered, only 34 women and children being spared, and they were carried into the settlements and made servants of." End quote. The Rangers would then return home to Austin to find themselves honored with a ball. And ironically, while they attended this ball, a group of Indians, tribe unknown, would sneak into the corral where the Rangers were keeping all their horses tied up. And while the Rangers were off dancing, their horses were stolen, about 40 of them. At this moment, this might be the first time the Comanches start to retreat. really anywhere. For about 140 years, ever since the Comanches were known to Europeans, the Comanches had been pushing further and further south. And now they'd met the Rangers. And it's at this point where the Comanches, for the first time in their tribe's known history, will have to take the defensive.